breaking news at the downtown St. Petersburg campus. There is a new question that has arisen. How has preventing voter fraud influenced recent electoral reform?
What is voting fraud?
I am glad you asked. Voting fraud is a change in the voting system that expresses public desires. What is voting? Well, that's an easy one. But by definition, it's the act of casting votes to decide on a candidate or possibly an issue, and even a contest such as Miss America. But we're talking about voting. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. This prohibited any discrimination when it came to vote. It is the most effective civil rights legislation that we have here in America, and it is enforced by our amendments in the Constitution, Amendments 14 and 15. These are imposing any voting laws resulting in any kind of discrimination. Yet, today, in 2015, some are trying to use a merely non-existent term, voting fraud, to influence electoral reform. How are they doing this? Well, one, by instituting voter ID laws, such as requiring voters to have a photo ID, such as a license, a passport, or now a gun license. You cannot even have a college ID as a form of identification. So in essence, no photo, no voto. This intimidates many minorities such as blacks, Latinos, college students such as us, and even elderly. Why? Because they might have an expired or suspended license, or they might not have a license. It might get lost, and to get a license and the documentation needed to get a license has become gruesome. And this kind of law is passed in 31 states already. Yet, if you have a gun, you can vote. You go to college. There are a few other ways voting fraud has influenced recent electoral reform. They have moved polls further away from your location, making it harder for you to get to the precinct. They've added computer technology to vote, making it very intimidating for the elderly. They're trying to do away with the absentee ballot to get rid of voting fraud. But what about people overseas, like the military or people with jobs? They are also talking about slashing early voting. There are millions of people who vote early to avoid long, tedious lines on voting day. This is obviously aimed at depriving voting, thus very discriminating. Isn't voting a free civil right? Let's talk about the truth. Is there really a lot of voting fraud that will really sway an election? Let's take a few examples. Kansas, 1.7 million registered voters and only 18 registered fraud cases. Ohio, 9,078,728 voters with only 4 fraud cases. That is 44 millionth of 1%, and Ohio isn't a swing state. God forbid your 44 millionth of 1% could sway the election in a swing state of Ohio and this guy become our president. That might not be so fun and very unrealistic. That is how minimal voting fraud really exists. Do not be intimidated by voting fraud. The real threat to democracy is not voter fraud. What's that? It is those who suppress the votes of millions of U.S. citizens by trying to prevent the non-existent fraud, by intimidating you from voting. You need to vote. Let's go and see what the public has to say.
You think about voting IDs.
Voting ID? Well, I got up to go to work that day, and I remembered, Lord Jesus, it's election day. I didn't grab my shoes or nothing, Lord Jesus. I ran to the voting polls, and then they said, I need a photo ID. I can't vote. I knew we got time for that. Thank you, Miss Emma. So, what we need to conclude from this is, don't let the term voting fraud influence your civil right to vote. There are many solutions that you can fight for. Back in 1856, the British colony, they had secret ballots. There's transparency, And there's always the idea of getting rid of electoral voting, where there are not swing states any longer. That's where anyone running for election must compete in all states, not just the swing states with the most electoral votes. If we got rid of the electoral votes, that would give a more even playing field out there in the field for voting. In conclusion, we the people say, stop trying to create a second class of citizens in terms of who gets to vote. Go get your grandma. Go get someone in poverty, a college friend, black friends, Latino friends, any minority, even people who don't have licenses. Help them get a license. The cost of no action is too costly. You have the right to vote. You're an American citizen. It is your right. See you at the polls.
This message is approved by Raquel Wilkes.